The laughter echoed through the restaurant like breaking glass. My sister Jessica held up her wrist, displaying her new Cartier watch while pointing at my grandmother's old silver bracelet with barely concealed disgust. "Sarah, honey, you know they make jewelry cleaner for a reason, right? That thing looks like it came from a garage sale." The entire table erupted in giggles, my mother covering her mouth with her manicured fingers, my father shaking his head like I was some kind of embarrassment. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Even my 8-year-old niece Sophia wrinkled her nose and whispered loudly, "Why does Aunt Sarah always wear ugly jewelry?" I sat there in that pristine Scottsdale steakhouse, surrounded by my family celebrating Jessica's latest promotion, feeling smaller than the ice cubes melting in my untouched water glass. The bracelet, a simple silver chain with what everyone assumed were cheap glass stones, had been my grandmother Elena's. She'd pressed it into my palm the night before she died, her weathered fingers trembling as she whispered, "Mija, this belongs to you. Promise me you'll never let them take it." I'd worn it every day for 3 years, through library shifts and Emma's school plays, through lonely dinners and sleepless nights. It was the only thing I had left of her, the only person who ever believed I was worth something. But as I watched Jessica's diamond earrings catch the light while she posed for Instagram photos, as I listened to my parents gush about her corner office and her husband David's latest tech startup success, I wondered if maybe they were right. Maybe I was holding on to worthless junk while my family lived in the real world of designer handbags and luxury cars. Maybe the woman who raised me in that tiny house filled with the smell of fresh tortillas and old books had left me nothing but costume jewelry and false hope. That night, I would discover just how wrong we all were. That night, everything would change. But first, let me tell you how a family can make you feel worthless for wearing a $5 million inheritance. My name is Sarah Martinez, and I've spent most of my 29 years being the family disappointment. While Jessica climbed corporate ladders in her power suits and stilettos, I chose books over boardrooms, quiet corners over conference calls. After college, I took a job at the Arizona State University Library, a decision that my mother still brings up at every gathering like a personal failure she can't quite process. "Sarah has her little book job," she'll say with a tight smile, the word little doing all the heavy lifting in that sentence. When Jessica bought her first house in Paradise Valley at 25, I was still renting a 2-bedroom apartment in Tempe, the kind of place where the air conditioning struggles against the desert heat and the neighbors' music bleeds through thin walls. The divide became even more pronounced after Emma came into my life. Her father disappeared before her first birthday, leaving me to navigate single motherhood while Jessica and David posted pictures of their European vacations and wine tastings. Emma is everything beautiful about this world, curious and kind with eyes that see magic in library story time and wonder in our weekend trips to Papago Park. But to my family, she represents another mark against me, proof that I make poor choices while Jessica makes executive decisions. My parents, Patricia and Robert Martinez, built their identity around appearances. Dad worked his way up in insurance, Mom dominated the Scottsdale real estate scene for decades before retirement, and together they created this fortress of respectability, where image mattered more than authenticity. Their house, a sprawling ranch-style monument to middle-class success, showcases Jessica's achievements like a shrine. Her MBA diploma hangs in the hallway, photos of her award ceremonies line the mantelpiece, and her business cards sit in a crystal holder on the coffee table. My library science degree lives forgotten in a box somewhere, and the only photos of Emma are tucked behind larger portraits of Sophia at her private school events. The bracelet became a symbol of everything they didn't understand about me. Grandmother Elena had been the black sheep of her generation, a woman who chose books over beauty pageants, who spoke 3 languages and wrote poetry in margins of newspapers. She lived modestly, worked as a seamstress, and filled her small house with treasures that others overlooked. After she died, my family descended on her belongings like vultures, my mother claiming the good china, Jessica taking the vintage furniture that would photograph well in her home. They left me with what they considered worthless, her books, her sewing supplies and her simple jewelry that looked outdated and cheap. But Elena had always seen something in me that others missed. During summers at her house, she'd tell me stories about her own grandmother, about jewelry that held memories and strength passed down through generations of women who survived with grace and dignity. She taught me that value couldn't always be measured in dollars or status symbols, that some treasures revealed themselves only to those patient enough to look beyond surface appearances. When she placed that bracelet in my hands during her final days, her voice weak but eyes fierce, she made me promise to wear it always, to remember that I carried something precious even when the world tried to convince me otherwise. For 3 years I kept that promise. Through Jessica's housewarming party where guests commented on my vintage style with barely concealed pity. Through family Christmas mornings where my homemade gifts looked shabby next to Jessica's expensive purchases. Through Emma's birthday parties where I served grocery store cake while other mothers brought elaborate confections from boutique bakeries. The bracelet sat on my wrist through every moment of quiet humiliation, every forced smile, every time I pretended their casual cruelty didn't leave marks. The worst part wasn't the mockery itself, but the way it made me question my own worth. When you hear often enough that your choices are wrong, your style is outdated, your life is small, you start to believe it. I began shopping for Emma's clothes.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
At thrift stores, not just for budget reasons, but because I convinced myself we didn't deserve better. I stopped wearing makeup to family events, because what was the point of trying to compete with Jessica's professional polish? I accepted their casual dismissal of my opinions, their interruption of my stories, their assumption that my input mattered less because my bank account was smaller. Working at the university library became my sanctuary, a place where knowledge mattered more than net worth, where students sought my help regardless of my jewelry or clothes. I specialized in rare books and historical archives, spending my days with treasures that others might overlook, but that contained infinite value to those who understood their significance. My supervisor, Dr. Catherine Williams, often remarked on my ability to identify valuable manuscripts that others had dismissed as worthless, to see potential in overlooked collections that later proved invaluable to researchers and historians. But even my professional successes felt hollow when filtered through my family's lens. When I helped the university acquire a rare collection of indigenous art that later became the centerpiece of a major exhibition, Jessica's response was, "That's nice, but when are you going to get a real job with benefits?" When Emma won the reading competition at her elementary school, something that filled me with pride beyond measure, my mother's comment was, "Well, at least she's good at something practical." Emma began to notice the dynamics during family gatherings. She'd sit closer to me during dinner conversations, her small hand finding mine under the table when the jokes became pointed, when the laughter felt sharp. At home she'd ask innocent questions that broke my heart. "Mama, why doesn't Grandma like your bracelet?" Or "Why do they always talk about Aunt Jessica but not about you?" I struggled to answer without poisoning her relationship with her grandparents, without passing down the hurt that had rooted itself so deeply in my chest. The summer Jessica got her latest promotion to regional marketing director, the family planned a celebration dinner at one of Scottsdale's most expensive restaurants. The invitation came with an unspoken dress code, the kind of place where my usual Target dresses and comfort shoes would mark me as the poor relation before I even spoke. I spent my grocery money on a simple black dress from a department store clearance rack, hoping to blend in, to avoid becoming the evening's entertainment through my obvious inadequacy. Emma stayed with our neighbor Mrs. Rodriguez that night, and I'm grateful she didn't witness what followed. The moment I walked into that restaurant, with its gold fixtures and crystal chandeliers, I felt the familiar knot in my stomach that accompanied family gatherings. Jessica held court at the head of the table, radiant in a silk blouse that probably cost more than my rent, surrounded by congratulations and admiration. David showed photos of their upcoming vacation to Italy, their new Tesla, their plans to renovate their already perfect kitchen. I tried to participate, to share enthusiasm for Jessica's success, but every attempt at conversation felt forced and awkward. When I mentioned Emma's acceptance into the gifted program at school, the topic quickly shifted to Sophia's private school achievements. When I shared excitement about a new exhibit I was curating at the library, my father patted my hand condescendingly and said, "That's nice, sweetheart, but maybe it's time to think about graduate school, something more substantial." The word substantial hung in the air like incense, heavy with judgment and dismissal. Then came the moment that would change everything, though I didn't know it yet. Jessica, flushed with wine and praise, began showing off her new jewelry, gifts from David to celebrate her promotion. The Cartier watch, the diamond tennis bracelet, the pearl necklace that belonged in a museum. Each piece was admired, photographed, valued aloud with the kind of reverence my family reserved for material success. "Sarah," Jessica said suddenly, her voice carrying that particular tone she used when she was about to perform for an audience, "you should really let me take you shopping sometime. I mean, I love that you're sentimental about grandma's things, but you're almost 30. Don't you think it's time to invest in some real jewelry?" The table turned toward me like spotlights, all eyes focusing on my wrist, where Elena's bracelet caught the restaurant's soft lighting. The silver had developed a patina over the decades, and the small stones, which I'd always assumed were glass, or perhaps low-grade crystals, looked dull compared to Jessica's sparkling diamonds. In that moment, surrounded by my family's expensive accessories and expectant faces, I felt like a child caught wearing dress-up clothes to a formal event. "It was grandmother's," I said quietly, the only defense I could muster. "Oh honey," my mother chimed in, her voice dripping with the kind of sympathy that felt more like pity. "Elena had lovely intentions, but she never had much money. That's probably from one of those home shopping networks she used to watch. Remember how she'd order those cubic zirconia sets?" The laughter started small, just Jessica's knowing giggle, but it spread around the table like wildfire. David made a joke about costume jewelry looking real under restaurant lighting. Sophia, taking cues from the adults, announced loudly that her friend's mom said only poor people wore fake diamonds. Even the server, clearing nearby tables, glanced over with barely concealed amusement at what must have looked like a family gently roasting their poor relation. I sat there burning with shame, feeling the weight of their judgment settling around my shoulders like a heavy coat. The bracelet, which had been my connection to Elena's strength and love, suddenly felt like evidence of my failure to grow up, to achieve, to deserve better. Part of me wanted to defend it, to explain how Elena had treasured it, how she'd worn it on special occasions and told me stories about its history. But another part of me, the part that had absorbed 3 years of casual dismissal and gentle mockery, wondered if they were right. Maybe I was clinging to worthless junk because I was afraid to want more, afraid to reach for the kind of success that might put me in Jessica's league. The conversation moved on to other topics, but I remained trapped in that moment of exposure, feeling raw and foolish. I excused myself to the bathroom, standing in front of the mirror and staring at my reflection, at the woman who looked tired and small and out of place among the restaurant's elegant fixtures. The bracelet sat on my wrist like a question mark, catching the light in ways that seemed almost mocking now that I knew how others saw it. When I returned to the table, the energy had shifted to planning future celebrations, discussions of Jessica's trajectory toward vice president, speculation about bonuses and stock options. I smiled and nodded and played the role of the supportive sister, but internally I was making calculations. How much would a decent piece of jewelry cost? How long would I need to save to buy something that wouldn't embarrass me at family gatherings? How much of my identity was I willing to sacrifice to fit into their vision of success? That night, driving home through the desert darkness with Phoenix's lights spreading below like fallen stars, I made a decision that would have seemed unthinkable hours earlier. I would have the bracelet appraised, not because I believed it was valuable, but because I needed to know definitively that I was holding on to nothing so I could finally let it go. If Elena's bracelet was worthless costume jewelry, then maybe it was time to stop being sentimental and start being practical. Maybe it was time to finally grow up and join the real world, even if it meant leaving behind the last connection to the only person who ever believed I was enough exactly as I was. I had no idea that within 24 hours, that simple decision would reveal the most stunning secret my family had ever encountered, one that would flip every assumption they'd made about value, worth, and who deserved respect in our carefully constructed hierarchy of success. The morning after the restaurant humiliation, I woke with a headache that felt like desert sun blazing directly into my skull. Emma had already left for her summer day camp, and the apartment felt too quiet, too heavy with the weight of last night's shame. I made coffee in my tiny kitchen, staring out the window at the parking lot where my 10-year-old Honda sat next to my neighbor's gleaming SUV, another reminder of how I consistently fell short of everyone else's standards. The bracelet lay on my nightstand, where I'd placed it before bed, looking even more tarnished and insignificant in the harsh morning light streaming through my bedroom window. For 3 years, I'd worn it daily, drawing comfort from its familiar weight on my wrist, feeling connected to Elena's memory through its simple presence. But now, after hearing my family's laughter echo in my mind all night, it felt like carrying around evidence of my own delusion. I picked it up, turning it over in my palm, studying the small stones that caught the light in subtle ways. They were clear with hints of color, some appearing almost blue in certain angles, others flashing with what looked like fire when the sun hit them directly. Elena had always been careful with it, storing it in a small velvet pouch when she wasn't wearing it, polishing it gently with a soft cloth. I'd assumed her care came from sentimental attachment, the way people treasure items that remind them of loved ones regardless of monetary value. But something nagged at me as I examined it more closely in the morning light. The craftsmanship looked more delicate than mass-produced jewelry, with tiny details in the setting that suggested individual attention rather than factory manufacturing. The silver, despite its patina, had a substantial feel that cheap costume jewelry typically lacked. And the stones, while small, seemed to have a clarity and brilliance that didn't match my family's dismissive assessment. I remembered Elena's words from that final evening, how she'd gripped my hand with surprising strength, and made me promise never to let them take it from me. At the time I'd interpreted her intensity as the attachment of an elderly woman to a cherished keepsake. But what if she'd meant something more literal? What if she'd known something about the bracelet's true nature that she'd never shared with the rest of the family? The thought seemed ridiculous even as it formed. Elena had lived modestly her entire life, working as a seamstress and living in the same small house for 50 years. If she'd owned anything truly valuable, surely she would have sold it during the lean times, the periods when money was tight and bills mounted. But then again, Elena had always been private about certain aspects of her past, dismissing questions about her life before marriage with vague comments about different times and family traditions. By noon I'd made up my mind. Phoenix had several reputable jewelry appraisers, and I could use my lunch break to visit one of them. Not because I believed the bracelet was valuable, but because I needed definitive proof of its worthlessness before I could bring myself to pack it away with Elena's other keepsakes. If I was going to move forward, to stop being the family member who clung to sentimental junk while everyone else embraced practical success, I needed to face reality with clear eyes. I chose Treasures and Time, an antique jewelry shop in central Phoenix that advertised certified appraisals. The drive took 20 minutes through midday traffic, air conditioning struggling against the summer heat that made the city shimmer like a mirage. The shop occupied a converted house in an older neighborhood, its exterior painted sage green with wooden shutters that suggested old-world craftsmanship rather than strip mall efficiency. Inside, the store felt like stepping into someone's elegant grandmother's living room. Glass cases displayed vintage brooches, estate rings, and necklaces that spoke of decades past, each piece arranged with careful attention to lighting and presentation. The air smelled faintly of lavender and old wood, a stark contrast to the sterile mall jewelry stores, where Jessica typically shopped for her status symbols. Dr. Margaret Thompson emerged from a back office, a woman in her 60s with silver hair pulled into a neat bun, and reading glasses hanging from a delicate chain. She wore a simple wool dress, and no jewelry except for small pearl earrings, her overall appearance suggesting someone more interested in substance than show. Her handshake was firm, her smile genuine, and when I explained my situation, she listened without the condescension I'd grown accustomed to from people in positions of expertise. Family pieces can be tricky, she said, leading me to a well-lit workstation, equipped with various magnifying tools and measurement devices. Sometimes what looks modest has extraordinary history, or craftsmanship that isn't immediately apparent. Would you mind if I examine it more closely? I slipped the bracelet off my wrist, surprised by how naked my arm felt without its familiar weight. Dr. Thompson handled it with the kind of care I'd seen Elena use, her movements deliberate and respectful as she positioned it under a high-powered magnifying lens. Her expression remained neutral as she studied the settings, the chain links, the individual stones, but I noticed her breathing change slightly, becoming more focused and deliberate. "May I ask where this piece came from?" she said after several minutes of silent examination, her voice carefully controlled in a way that made my pulse quicken. "It belonged to my grandmother," I explained, suddenly aware of how inadequate that information sounded. "She passed away 3 years ago, and left it to me. My family thinks it's costume jewelry from a home shopping network, but I wanted to know for certain before I decided what to do with it." Dr. Thompson nodded slowly, reaching for a different magnifying tool and adjusting the lighting around the workstation. "Can you tell me anything about your grandmother's background?" Where she might have acquired this piece. Elena Martinez, I said, feeling foolish for how little I actually knew about her history. She was born in Mexico, but moved to Arizona as a young woman. She worked as a seamstress most of her life, never had much money that I knew of. She was always very private about her past, especially anything that happened before she married my grandfather. And she specifically left this to you. Yes, I said, remembering that final conversation with painful clarity. She made me promise to never let them take it from me. I thought she just meant the family, keeping it from being sold at an estate sale or something. Thompson was quiet for a long moment, studying something through her magnifying lens with intense concentration. When she finally looked up, her expression had changed completely, a mixture of excitement and careful professional composure that made my stomach flip with unexpected nervousness. Martinez, she said slowly. I need to run some additional tests before I can give you a definitive assessment. Would it be possible for you to leave this with me for a few hours? I want to bring in a colleague who specializes in antique diamond evaluation. The word diamond hit me like ice water. Diamond? You think these are diamonds? I think, Dr. Thompson said carefully, that your grandmother left you something far more significant than your family realized. But I don't want to speculate until we can confirm what we're looking at. Can you return around 4 o'clock? I drove back to the library in a daze, barely remembering the route through streets that suddenly felt unfamiliar, despite 3 years of daily navigation. The possibility that Elena's bracelet might be genuinely valuable seemed too surreal to process, like discovering you'd been carrying around a winning lottery ticket without realizing it. I tried to focus on my afternoon tasks, helping students locate research materials and cataloging new acquisitions, but my mind kept drifting to Dr. Thompson's carefully neutral expression and her mention of diamond evaluation. Emma called during my afternoon break, her voice bright with stories from day camp arts and crafts project. Mama, we made friendship bracelets today. Mine has purple and blue because those are your favorite colors. Can I give it to you when you pick me up? Of course, baby, I said, touched by her thoughtfulness, even as my mind wrestled with the morning's unexpected developments. I can't wait to see it. Mrs. Rodriguez says friendship bracelets are special because they're made with love, not because they're expensive. She says the most beautiful jewelry is the kind that connects people's hearts. Her innocent wisdom felt like a message from the universe, a reminder that value couldn't always be measured in dollars regardless of what the appraisal revealed. But as 4 o'clock approached, I found myself driving back to Treasures and Time, with hands that trembled slightly on the steering wheel, and a heart that hammered with anticipation I didn't want to acknowledge. Dr. Thompson was waiting for me with another woman, introduced as Dr. Sarah Chen, a certified gemologist who specialized in antique and estate jewelry. Both women wore expressions of barely contained excitement that made my mouth go dry with possibilities I was afraid to consider. Miss Martinez, Dr. Thompson began, what I'm about to tell you is going to sound impossible, but I want you to know that we've run every test available to confirm our findings. She gestured to the bracelet, now displayed under professional lighting that made the stones catch fire in ways I'd never noticed before. Under the specialized illumination, the simple silver chain and modest stones looked transformed, each element radiating light and color that seemed almost alive. The stones in your grandmother's bracelet are natural diamonds, Dr. Chen said, her voice steady, but eyes bright with professional enthusiasm. Not just any diamonds, but stones of exceptional quality and rarity. The largest stone, which measures approximately 2 carats, is a Type 2A diamond with perfect clarity and unusual blue fluorescence. The smaller stones, while more modest in size, show similar characteristics of exceptional quality and craftsmanship. I stared at them, certain I'd misheard or misunderstood something fundamental about their explanation. Diamonds, but they look so ordinary. I mean, they don't sparkle like the diamonds I've seen in jewelry stores. That's because of the setting style, Dr. Thompson explained, pointing to the delicate silver work that held each stone. This is what we call old mine cut and rose cut diamond work, popular in the late 1800s and early 1900s. The cutting techniques were different then, designed to maximize the stone's natural beauty, rather than create the brilliant flashes of light we associate with modern diamond cutting. These stones would have been cut by hand, probably in Europe, and set by master craftsmen who understood how to showcase their natural properties. The silver work is also significant, Dr. Chen added. This isn't just silver-plated base metal. The chain and settings are crafted from high-quality sterling silver with techniques that suggest European workshop origins, possibly Spanish or Portuguese, given the style of metalwork. My mind struggled to process their words, to reconcile their professional assessment with my family's casual dismissal of the bracelet as worthless costume jewelry. But if this is real, if these are actual diamonds, wouldn't my grandmother have known? Wouldn't she have told someone? The two women exchanged glances that suggested they'd already discussed this question. It's quite possible she did know, Dr. Thompson said gently. Many families have stories of jewelry hidden during times of political upheaval or economic hardship, pieces that were meant to be emergency resources for future generations. The craftsmanship and style suggest this bracelet could have been created anywhere from the 1880s to the 1920s, possibly in Europe, before being brought to the Americas. Your grandmother's background in Mexico could be significant, Dr. Chen continued. Many families fleeing political or economic instability in Europe during the early 20th century settled in Mexico before eventually moving to the United States. They often carried their most valuable possessions in forms that wouldn't attract attention from authorities or thieves. You're saying this could be some kind of family heirloom? More than that, Dr. Thompson said, reaching for a formal appraisal document. Based on the quality of the diamonds, the historical significance of the craftsmanship, and the rarity of finding pieces like this in original condition, we estimate the current market value of your grandmother's bracelet at approximately $5 million. The number hit me like physical force, knocking the breath from my lungs, and making the room spin around me. $5 million. The phrase repeated in my mind, like an echo, meaningless and impossible and terrifying all at once. I gripped the edge of the workstation to steady myself, staring at the bracelet that suddenly looked like it belonged in a museum rather than on my wrist. That can't be right, I whispered, my voice barely audible even to myself. 5 million? That's impossible. My grandmother was a seamstress. She lived in a tiny house and worried about grocery bills. If she'd owned something worth $5 million, she never would have lived like that. Actually, Dr. Chen said quietly, she might have had very good reasons for keeping its true value secret. Pieces like this often come with complicated histories, and families sometimes choose to preserve them rather
Then sell them, passing down both the jewelry and the responsibility of protecting it to future generations. Dr. Thompson handed me the formal appraisal document, multiple pages of technical descriptions and photographs that documented every aspect of the bracelet's construction and estimated value. The letterhead looked official and intimidating, the kind of paperwork that belonged in bank vaults and insurance policies rather than in the hands of a librarian wearing a Target dress and driving a decade-old Honda. What do I do with this information? I asked, still staring at the numbers that seemed to grow larger every time I read them. How do I even begin to process something like this? That's entirely up to you, Dr. Thompson said. Some people choose to sell pieces like this using the money to secure their family's future. Others prefer to keep them as heirlooms, understanding that they're guardians of something that transcends monetary value. There's no right or wrong choice, only what feels appropriate for your circumstances and values. I thought about Emma, about the life I'd been building for us on a librarian's salary and careful budgeting. $5 million could pay for her college education, could buy us a house in a good neighborhood, could eliminate every financial worry that kept me awake at night calculating bills and grocery budgets. But I also thought about Elena, about her careful preservation of this secret through decades of modest living, about her insistence that I promise never to let them take it from me. Can I ask you something? I said, looking between the two experts who'd just turned my world upside down. Do you think my grandmother knew what this was worth? They considered the question seriously, their expressions thoughtful and professional. Based on the condition and the way it's been cared for over the years, Dr. Chen said finally, I believe she not only knew its value but understood its significance. The kind of care this piece has received, the preservation of original settings and the maintenance of the silver work, suggests someone who recognized what they were protecting. Which means, Dr. Thompson added gently, she chose to live modestly while safeguarding something she intended for you to discover when the time was right. I drove home through Phoenix traffic that seemed surreal and dreamlike, the appraisal document sitting in my passenger seat like a bomb waiting to explode my carefully constructed understanding of reality. Every red light gave me time to stare at the bracelet, now secured in a small jewelry box Dr. Thompson had provided, trying to reconcile its modest appearance with the staggering figure written on official letterhead. $5 million. The amount represented more money than I'd earn in multiple lifetimes, more than my entire family's combined net worth, more than Jessica's house and cars and designer lifestyle multiplied several times over. It was enough to change everything, to catapult Emma and me into a different social class entirely, to make my family's casual dismissal of my choices look not just wrong but laughably ignorant. But alongside the shock and disbelief, I felt something else growing in my chest, a deep, burning anger that surprised me with its intensity. For 3 years I'd endured their mockery of Elena's bracelet, their casual assumption that everything associated with me was somehow lesser and worthless. Jessica had literally pointed and laughed at it just last night, suggesting I needed her help to buy real jewelry while wearing what she assumed was costume junk worth, perhaps $20. The irony was almost too perfect to be real. While Jessica collected her Cartier watches and David showed off their latest luxury purchases, I'd been carrying around a piece of jewelry worth more than their house, their cars, and their entire portfolio combined. The woman they'd dismissed as sentimental and impractical had been entrusted with a treasure that made their material success look like child's play in comparison. I thought about Elena's final words, her insistence that I never let them take it from me, and realized she might have understood my family's dynamics better than I'd given her credit for. Perhaps she'd seen how they treated me, how they measured worth in dollars and status symbols, and chosen to leave me something that would vindicate every choice they'd criticized, every path they'd dismissed as insufficient. When I picked up Emma from Mrs. Rodriguez's apartment, she bounced toward me with the friendship bracelet she'd made at camp, a simple creation of purple and blue strings that she'd woven with 8-year-old concentration and love. As she tied it around my wrist, chattering about her day and the friends she'd made, I realized I was wearing jewelry that represented two completely different kinds of value, one measured in millions of dollars, the other beyond any price at all. "Mama, you look different today," Emma said as we walked to our apartment. "Like you discovered something exciting." "I did, baby," I said, squeezing her hand as we climbed the stairs to our modest home. "I discovered that your great-grandmother was even more amazing than we knew." That night, after Emma fell asleep, I sat in my living room with both bracelets on my wrists, staring at the appraisal document and trying to decide what to do with information that felt too enormous to contain. Tomorrow, I would have to face the world with this secret burning inside me, would have to interact with my family knowing what they'd dismissed so casually, what they'd mocked so confidently. The question wasn't whether to tell them about the appraisal. The question was how to handle the revelation that would upend everything they thought they knew about value, worth, and which family member deserved their respect. The secret felt like swallowing lightning. For 3 days after the appraisal, I moved through my routine at the library, helped Emma with her summer reading, made grocery lists and paid bills, all while carrying the knowledge that my modest life was built on top of a fortune so vast it defied comprehension. The bracelet sat in its jewelry box on my dresser, no longer the simple comfort I'd worn daily, but something that seemed to pulse with dangerous energy every time I looked at it. Sleep became elusive. I'd lie awake calculating what $5 million could mean. Emma's entire education paid for with money left over for graduate school, a house in the best neighborhood in Phoenix, financial security that stretched into generations I hadn't even imagined yet. But those dreams collided with Elena's memory, with the weight of responsibility she'd placed in my hands, with questions I couldn't answer about why she'd chosen to live so modestly while safeguarding such extraordinary wealth. The insurance alone required immediate attention. Dr. Thompson had provided contacts for specialized coverage, explaining that homeowners insurance wouldn't begin to cover a loss of this magnitude. I spent my lunch break on Wednesday speaking with representatives who asked questions about security systems and safe deposit boxes with the casual expertise of people who regularly handled items worth more than most people's houses. The monthly premium would consume a significant portion of my salary, but the alternative of remaining uninsured felt reckless beyond measure. Emma noticed my distraction during our evening routines, the way I'd pause mid-sentence while reading her bedtime stories, how I'd stare into space during dinner conversations about her day at camp. "Mama, are you worried about something?" she asked Thursday night as I tucked her into bed, her dark eyes reflecting concern that seemed too mature for 8 years old. "Just thinking about grown-up stuff, baby," I said, smoothing her hair back from her forehead. "Nothing for you to worry about." "Is it about great-grandma Elena's bracelet? You haven't been wearing it since you went to that jewelry store." Her observation hit me like a physical blow. Emma was right, I hadn't worn the bracelet since the appraisal, too afraid of losing or damaging something worth more than most people would see in multiple lifetimes. But Elena had worn it regularly, had treated it as jewelry meant to be enjoyed rather than hidden away like a museum piece. Great-grandma Elena wanted me to wear it because it connected us, I said carefully. But now I know it's very special, so I want to make sure I take good care of it. Maybe she'd want you to still wear it, Emma said with 8-year-old logic. Maybe taking good care of it means remembering why she gave it to you, not just keeping it safe in a box. Friday morning brought a text from Jessica that made my stomach clench with unexpected dread. Family barbecue Sunday at Mom and Dad's. Bring Emma. David's grilling, and Sophia's been asking about her cousin. The casual invitation carried undertones I recognized. The assumption that I'd rearrange my weekend plans to accommodate their gathering, that my presence was expected but not particularly valued beyond filling out the family photo. Normally, I'd respond immediately with confirmation, grateful to be included despite knowing I'd spend the afternoon listening to updates about Jessica's professional achievements and David's latest business ventures, while my own life remained largely unexamined. But now, carrying the secret of Elena's bracelet, the prospect of another family gathering, felt loaded with potential for disaster or vindication. I stared at the text for 20 minutes, thumb hovering over the keyboard while my mind raced through possibilities. I could attend and say nothing, enduring another round of subtle condescension while knowing I possessed something that made their material success look insignificant. I could find an excuse to skip the gathering entirely, avoiding the temptation to reveal information that would fundamentally alter our family dynamics. Or I could go and wear the bracelet, waiting to see if anyone noticed or commented, giving them the opportunity to mock it one more time before learning the truth. The third option terrified and thrilled me in equal measure. There was something deeply appealing about the idea of letting them condemn themselves through their own words, of giving them enough rope to hang themselves with their assumptions about value and worth. But there was also enormous risk in such a confrontation, the possibility of burning bridges, that despite their limitations still connected me to the only family Emma and I had. Saturday passed in a haze of internal debate. I tried to focus on weekend activities with Emma, taking her to the Children's Museum, and letting her choose our lunch destination, but my mind kept drifting to scenarios for Sunday's gathering. Emma seemed to sense my preoccupation, asking fewer questions than usual, and staying closer to my side during our outings, her small hand finding mine more frequently than normal. That evening, as I watched her play with her dolls in the living room, creating elaborate stories about families and adventures, I realized that my decision about the bracelet wasn't just about me or my relationship with my parents and sister. Emma was watching, learning from my choices about how to handle conflict, how to respond to disrespect, how to value herself in the face of others' judgment. Whatever I chose to do would become part of her understanding of strength and dignity. Sunday morning arrived with the kind of blazing sunshine that made Phoenix feel like the surface of another planet. I dressed carefully in a coral sundress that Emma had helped me pick out, pairing it with sandals that were comfortable enough for chasing an 8-year-old around my parents' backyard. The bracelet sat in its box on my dresser, catching morning light through the bedroom window, like a question I hadn't yet found the courage to answer. "Are you going to wear Great-Grandma Elena's bracelet today?" Emma asked as she brushed her teeth, watching me in the bathroom mirror, with eyes that seemed to see more than I was comfortable acknowledging. "I'm thinking about it," I said honestly. "What do you think I should do?" She rinsed and spit, considering the question with the seriousness she brought to all matters involving family relationships. "I think Great-Grandma Elena would want you to wear it, if it makes you feel strong, and I think she'd want everyone to see how pretty it is." Her simple wisdom cut through my complicated calculations, reminding me that Elena had entrusted me with the bracelet, not as a burden, but as a gift meant to be cherished and displayed. I fastened it around my wrist for the first time since the appraisal, feeling its familiar weight settle against my skin like a homecoming. In the mirror it looked exactly as it always had, modest, elegant, beautiful in an understated way, that spoke of craftsmanship rather than ostentation. The drive to my parents' house in Scottsdale took us through neighborhoods that showcased Phoenix's economic hierarchy, from the apartment complexes and modest homes near the university, to the sprawling properties with desert landscaping and circular driveways that spoke of serious money. My parents' house occupied a middle tier, impressive enough to demonstrate their success, but not so elaborate as to suggest actual wealth. Emma chattered about her excitement to see Sophia and her hopes that Uncle David would let her help with the grilling, her enthusiasm infectious enough to momentarily distract me from the weight of potential confrontation ahead. But as we pulled into the familiar driveway, my heart rate increased noticeably, the bracelet feeling heavier on my wrist with each step toward the front door. Jessica's Tesla sat in the driveway next to David's BMW, their vehicles gleaming in the desert sun, like trophies of professional achievement. My Honda looked shabby by comparison, its faded paint and modest proportions announcing my economic status before I even rang the doorbell. "Sarah, Emma," my mother called out as she opened the door, immediately sweeping Emma into a hug, while offering me a brief smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You're just in time. Jessica and David are already out back with Sophia." The house smelled like barbecue smoke, and the expensive candles my mother favored, a combination that always reminded me of childhood visits, when such gatherings felt magical, rather than fraught with undercurrents of comparison and judgment. Emma ran ahead toward the backyard, her excitement about seeing her cousin temporarily overwhelming any awareness of adult tensions. "How's work?" my mother asked as we walked through the house, her tone carrying the particular quality she used when asking about aspects of my life she didn't quite understand or value. "Still enjoying the library?" "Very much," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. "We're working on a new exhibit about Arizona's territorial period, some fascinating pieces from local families." "That's nice," she replied with the dismissive warmth I'd grown accustomed to, the verbal equivalent of patting me on the head before moving on to more interesting topics. "Jessica was just telling us about her new project at work. They're launching a marketing campaign for some tech startup that could really put her on the map." The backyard buzzed with family energy, David manning the grill with characteristic precision, while Jessica lounged in a chair that positioned her perfectly to supervise both the cooking and Sophia's play in the pool. She wore a white sundress that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget, accessorized with the kind of jewelry that announced its expense from across the yard. "Sarah," Jessica called out, not rising from her chair, but lifting her sunglasses to examine my appearance with the casual thoroughness she'd perfected over the years. "You look cute. Very teacherish." The backhanded compliment stung exactly as intended, reducing my careful outfit choice to something appropriate for elementary school, rather than adult sophistication. But I smiled and accepted the assessment, taking a seat at the patio table where my father was reading news on his tablet while nursing a beer. "How's my working girl?" he asked without looking up, his attention split between family gathering and whatever article had captured his interest. Keeping busy with all those books, Emma had already gravitated toward Sophia, the two girls chattering excitedly about summer camp experiences and upcoming school year plans. Their easy camaraderie provided a welcome distraction from the adult conversations I knew would eventually turn toward updates about Jessica's career trajectory and David's latest business ventures. The gathering proceeded according to familiar patterns. David shared stories about his startup's latest funding round, while Jessica detailed her increasing responsibilities and growing influence within her company. My parents listened with the kind of rapt attention they'd never shown toward my professional experiences, asking follow-up questions, and offering praise that felt both genuine and exclusive. I contributed when directly addressed, sharing carefully edited updates about library programs and Emma's summer activities, but mostly observed the family dynamics that had shaped my understanding of worth and belonging for nearly 3 decades. The bracelet felt warm against my wrist, Elena's presence somehow tangible in the desert heat and chlorinated air. "That's such an interesting bracelet," David said suddenly, his comment cutting through Jessica's monologue about quarterly performance reviews. "Very vintage looking. Where did you find it?" The question landed like a stone thrown into still water, creating ripples of attention that focused every adult eye on my wrist. Jessica's gaze sharpened with the particular intensity she brought to discussions of fashion and accessories, while my parents looked over with the mild curiosity they typically showed toward my personal choices. "It was my grandmother's," I said simply, keeping my voice level, despite the sudden acceleration of my heartbeat. "Elena left it to me." "Oh right," Jessica said with a laugh that carried undertones of the restaurant incident. "The costume jewelry from that home shopping network. I keep telling Sarah she should let me take her shopping for some real pieces, but she's so sentimental about family things." "There's nothing wrong with sentimental jewelry," David said diplomatically, though his tone suggested agreement with Jessica's assessment. "Some of those vintage reproductions are actually quite well made. The stones do catch the light nicely," my mother added, leaning forward to examine the bracelet more closely. "Elena always did have an eye for pretty things, even if she couldn't afford the real versions." Their casual dismissal felt different this time, weighted with knowledge that transformed their condescension into something approaching comedy. I sat quietly, letting them dig themselves deeper into assumptions that would soon look foolish beyond measure, watching as they constructed their own humiliation through confident ignorance. "You know what we should do," Jessica said, her voice brightening with sudden inspiration. "We should take it to that jewelry store, in Kierland Commons, the one where I got my tennis bracelet appraised for insurance. They could tell you exactly what it's worth, maybe give you some ideas for upgrading to something more contemporary." "That's actually a great idea," my father chimed in, finally looking up from his tablet with interest. "Might be time to invest in some adult jewelry, sweetheart, something that reflects where you are in life now." The irony was so perfect it felt scripted. Here was my family, offering to help me discover the value of jewelry they'd already decided was worthless, suggesting I needed their guidance to understand what I was wearing. The temptation to reveal the truth immediately was almost overwhelming, but something in me wanted to let this moment stretch, to give them enough time to fully commit to their position before the ground shifted beneath their feet. "I actually did have it appraised," I said quietly, the words dropping into the conversation like pebbles into a pond. The confession created a moment of surprised silence before Jessica burst into laughter. "Oh my God, you actually paid someone to look at Grandma's costume jewelry. Sarah honey, please tell me you didn't spend money on that. How much did they try to charge you?" My mother asked, her voice mixing concern with amusement. "Some of those places really take advantage of people who don't know better." "They didn't charge me anything for the consultation," I said, pulling out my phone with hands that trembled slightly. "But they did provide me with a written appraisal." I'd photographed the document that morning, unsure whether I'd have the courage to show it but wanting the option available. Now, as my family exchanged glances that mixed pity with exasperation at my apparent gullibility, I realized the moment had arrived to flip their understanding of reality completely upside down. "Let me guess," David said with the kind of gentle condescension he typically reserved for explaining technology to older relatives. "They told you it was worth a few $100s, and tried to buy it from you." "Not exactly," I said, finding the photo on my phone, and setting it on the table where everyone could see the official letterhead and formal language of Dr. Thompson's appraisal. Jessica reached for the phone first, her expression shifting from amused skepticism to confusion as she read the document. "This says," she began then stopped, reading more carefully. "This can't be right, Sarah. This says $5 million. $5 million what?" my father asked, leaning over to see the screen, while my mother moved closer with sudden intense interest. "Dollars," Jessica whispered, her voice barely audible, as she continued staring at the appraisal. "It says this bracelet is worth $5 million. The silence that followed felt like the moment before thunder, pregnant with implications that nobody seemed able to process. David grabbed the phone, scrolling through the detailed technical descriptions and photographs that documented every aspect of the bracelet's construction and materials. My parents stared at my wrist, as if seeing it for the first time, their expressions cycling between disbelief and dawning realization. "This has to be some kind of mistake," my mother said finally, her voice shaky with confusion. "Elena never had anything like this. She worked in a sewing factory. She lived in that tiny house, and worried about utility bills." "The appraisers ran multiple tests," I said calmly, watching as the family dynamics shifted in real time around the patio table. "These are natural diamonds, hand-cut in the European style, probably from the late 1800s. The craftsmanship suggests workshop origins, possibly Spanish or Portuguese. But that would mean," Jessica started, then trailed off as the implications hit her fully. "That would mean you've been wearing $5 million worth of diamonds to family dinners and grocery stores and work." "Elena wore it too," I said quietly. "Every Sunday to church, every family gathering, every special occasion. She treated it like jewelry meant to be enjoyed, not hidden away." David was reading the appraisal details, with the intensity he typically brought to business contracts, his expression growing more serious as he absorbed the technical specifications and estimated values. "These are certified gemologists," he said slowly. "This isn't some pawn shop evaluation. This is a legitimate appraisal from recognized experts." The weight of realization settled over the gathering like a blanket, muffling conversation and transforming the casual family barbecue into something that felt charged with significance none of us had anticipated. Emma and Sophia continued playing in the pool, oblivious to the adult drama unfolding around the patio table, their laughter providing an incongruous soundtrack to the moment that would reshape our family's understanding of worth, value, and who among us had been living with hidden treasure all along. The silence stretched across the patio like a spider web, delicate and loaded with tension that threatened to snap at any moment. Jessica stared at the appraisal document, as if it might transform into something more comprehensible, if she looked long enough, while my parents exchanged glances that carried decades of unspoken communication about family dynamics they were struggling to recalibrate. "This can't be real," my mother finally whispered, her voice carrying the kind of bewilderment reserved for moments when fundamental assumptions about reality suddenly crumble. "Sarah, you're telling us that Elena walked around wearing millions of dollars on her wrist, while clipping coupons and shopping at thrift stores?" "Apparently so," I said, surprised by how calm I felt, as my family's world tilted sideways around the concrete truth of professional gemological evaluation. "She chose to live modestly, while protecting something she intended for future generations." David scrolled through the appraisal photos, with the methodical attention he brought to business documents, pausing at images that showed the bracelet under professional lighting. "The documentation is thorough," he said slowly, his tone carrying the respect he typically reserved for serious financial matters. "Multiple expert evaluations, detailed specifications, insurance recommendations. This isn't someone trying to inflate value for a quick sale." "But why wouldn't she tell anyone?" Jessica asked, her voice rising with frustration that seemed directed at Elena's secrecy, rather than her own previous dismissal of the bracelet's worth. "Why live like she was poor, if she was sitting on a fortune?" The question revealed everything about Jessica's understanding of value and choice, her inability to comprehend motivations beyond material display. I thought about Elena's tiny house filled with books and laughter, her Sunday dinners, where conversation mattered more than expensive ingredients, her quiet dignity that never required external validation. "Maybe she understood the difference between having money and needing to show it," I said quietly, watching as my words landed with varying degrees of comprehension around the table. "Maybe she valued security over status symbols." "Security," my father interjected, his voice sharp with the kind of practical concern that had driven his insurance career. "What's secure about wearing $5 million to the grocery store? That's not security, that's reckless endangerment." His reaction crystallized everything about our family's approach to wealth and risk. The assumption that valuable things should be hidden away rather than enjoyed, that extraordinary possessions existed primarily to generate anxiety rather than pleasure. I realized Elena had understood this mentality perfectly, had chosen to live quietly with her treasure, rather than subject herself to the kind of fearful management my father was already contemplating. "She made it look ordinary," I said, glancing down at the bracelet that still appeared modest, despite carrying a price tag larger than most people's retirement funds. "The craftsmanship is subtle enough that it only reveals its true nature under professional examination. She could wear it everywhere, because nobody looked closely enough to recognize what they were seeing. Except now we know," Jessica said, her voice carrying undertones I couldn't quite interpret. "Now we all know what you've been carrying around." Something in her tone made the hair on my arms prickle with uneasiness. The initial shock was fading, replaced by expressions of calculation that I recognized from family discussions about inheritance, property distribution, and financial planning. I watched my sister's face transform as she processed not just the bracelet's value, but its implications for family dynamics she'd never questioned. "Elena specifically left this to Sarah," my mother said slowly, as if testing the words against some internal resistance. "But surely she didn't understand what she was doing. If she'd known the real value, she would have made different arrangements." "Different how?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew where this conversation was heading. "Well, family
Heirlooms this valuable should probably be held in trust," David said, his business training engaging automatically when faced with significant assets. "Shared among family members or at least insured and protected properly. $5 million is beyond individual ownership, especially when there are children involved who might benefit from educational funding." The suggestion landed like ice water in my veins. Here was my family, faced with evidence that their casual dismissal of my inheritance had been catastrophically wrong, already working to rationalize why I shouldn't be trusted with Elena's gift. Within minutes of learning the truth, they were constructing arguments for why the bracelet shouldn't remain in my possession. "Elena chose to leave it to me," I said, my voice steady despite the anger building in my chest. "She made that decision specifically and deliberately." "But Elena couldn't have anticipated this situation," Jessica said, her tone taking on the reasonable quality she used in business negotiations. "She probably thought she was leaving you a nice keepsake worth maybe a few $100s. If she'd known the real value, she would have wanted it handled differently." "You mean she would have wanted it handled by you?"
The directness of my question created another moment of uncomfortable silence, broken only by the sound of Emma and Sophia playing in the pool and the distant hum of David's forgotten barbecue. Jessica's flush revealed that I'd hit closer to the truth than she'd intended to show. I'm just saying that decisions about family assets this significant should involve the whole family, she said carefully. We all loved Elena, we all have connections to family history, and we all have children who could benefit from this kind of generational wealth. Interesting, I said, standing up from the patio table with movements that felt deliberate and controlled. Because when you thought it was worthless costume jewelry, none of you wanted anything to do with it. In fact, you've spent years making jokes about my attachment to worthless junk. The accusation hung in the desert air like heat shimmer, distorting the familiar landscape of family relationships into something that looked increasingly foreign. I walked to the edge of the pool where Emma was teaching Sophia a new swimming stroke, their innocent interaction providing stark contrast to the adult maneuvering happening behind us. That's not fair, my mother protested. We never meant to hurt your feelings about the bracelet, we just didn't realize what it was. You're right, I said, turning back to face them. You didn't realize what it was, just like you've never realized what I am. The words came out sharper than I'd intended, cutting through the family gathering like Elena's bracelet cutting through assumptions about value and worth. But instead of softening them, I let them settle into the space between us, allowed the truth to exist without apology or explanation. Sarah, that's not, my father began, but I held up a hand to stop him. For 3 years you've made jokes about this bracelet every time I wore it. You've suggested I was being sentimental and impractical, that I needed guidance about appropriate jewelry for a woman my age. Last week, Jessica literally pointed and laughed at it, suggesting I needed her help to buy something real. Jessica opened her mouth to protest, but I continued before she could construct another rationalization. And now, faced with evidence that you were completely wrong, that Elena entrusted me with something worth more than all of your possessions combined, your first instinct isn't to apologize or acknowledge your mistakes. Your first instinct is to find ways to take it away from me. The truth of their behavior, laid out in plain language, created the kind of uncomfortable recognition that made everyone shift in their chairs and avoid direct eye contact. David cleared his throat and made a show of checking the barbecue, while my parents exchanged glances that carried years of practiced deflection. Nobody's trying to take anything away from you, Jessica said finally, her voice carrying the hurt tone she'd perfected for situations where her motives were questioned. We're just concerned about the responsibility. $5 million is a lot to handle alone. I've been handling it alone for 3 years, I pointed out, successfully apparently since it's still intact and properly maintained. But you didn't know what you were handling, my mother said. That's completely different from making informed decisions about something this valuable. Her logic revealed the fundamental flaw in their reasoning, the assumption that my competence was somehow tied to my awareness of monetary value rather than my actual care and responsibility. Elena had trusted me with her treasure specifically because she'd observed how I handled things that mattered regardless of their market price. Elena knew exactly what she was doing, I said quietly. She chose to leave this to me because she trusted my judgment, not because she underestimated its value. How can you possibly know that? Jessica demanded, her frustration finally breaking through her careful diplomatic tone. Elena never said anything about diamonds or appraisals or $5 million. She told me never to let them take it from me. I said, the memory of Elena's final words carrying new weight in light of current circumstances. I thought she meant the family in general, but maybe she meant specifically the people who would only want it once they understood what it was worth. The accusation hit its target with precision that surprised even me. Jessica's face went pale except for 2 bright spots of color on her cheeks, while my parents looked genuinely stricken by the implication that they'd proven Elena's concerns about their motivations. That's a terrible thing to say, my mother whispered. We love you, Sarah. This isn't about money, isn't it? I asked, gesturing toward the appraisal document that still lay on the patio table like evidence in a trial. Because 15 minutes ago, when you thought this bracelet was worthless, you were perfectly happy to let me keep wearing my sentimental junk. Now that you know it's worth $5 million, suddenly it's too valuable for me to handle alone. Emma called out from the pool, asking if I could watch her demonstrate the backstroke she'd been practicing. I walked over to the pool edge, kneeling down to give her my full attention, while my family sat in uncomfortable silence behind me. Her technique was improving rapidly, her small body cutting through the chlorinated water with growing confidence and grace. That's beautiful, baby, I said, genuinely impressed by her progress.
Great-grandma Elena would be so proud of how hard you've been working. Do you think she can see me from heaven? Emma asked, treading water with ease while Sophia floated nearby on an inflatable unicorn. I think she sees everything that matters, I said, glancing back at my family who were engaged in what appeared to be intense whispered conversation. And I think she's happy that you're learning to be strong in the water. When I returned to the patio table, the atmosphere had shifted again. My parents and Jessica wore expressions of forced calm that suggested they'd reached some kind of consensus during my brief absence. David was serving grilled chicken and vegetables with movements that seemed deliberately normal, as if insisting that lunch could proceed despite the fundamental disruption to family understanding. We've been talking, my father said carefully, and we want you to know that we support whatever decision you make about the bracelet. It's yours, and we respect Elena's wishes. The statement sounded rehearsed, delivered with the kind of careful neutrality that suggested significant discussion and compromise behind the scenes. I appreciated the attempt at peacemaking, but couldn't quite shake the feeling that I was hearing a strategic retreat rather than genuine acceptance. However, Jessica added, and I felt my stomach tense in anticipation of whatever qualification was coming, we do think you should consider some practical steps to protect yourself and Emma. Professional financial planning, proper insurance, maybe a consultation with an estate attorney about inheritance implications. Her suggestions were reasonable enough to make outright rejection seem stubborn, but I recognized the pattern from years of family interactions. This was how major decisions got made in our family: initial resistance followed by practical concerns that gradually shifted control toward whoever was most comfortable managing complexity. I've already arranged for specialized insurance, I said, watching surprise flicker across their faces. And I plan to consult with financial advisors about long-term planning, but those decisions will be made based on what's best for Emma and me, not what makes the rest of the family comfortable. The boundary I'd just drawn felt clean and definitive, separating my choices from their opinions in ways that hadn't existed before this afternoon. For the first time in family discussions about important matters, I wasn't seeking their approval or guidance. I was informing them of decisions I'd already made independently. Of course, my mother said quickly, we just want to make sure you have all the support you need. I appreciate that, I said, meaning it despite my wariness about their motivations. But I think it's important to be clear that this changes our family dynamic significantly. I'm not the struggling single mother who needs financial advice and practical guidance anymore. Elena made sure of that. The acknowledgement hung between us like a bridge across a canyon, spanning the gap between who I'd been in their eyes and who I was becoming in my own understanding. Jessica looked particularly uncomfortable with this shift. Her role as the successful sister who offered guidance to her less fortunate sibling suddenly complicated by economic realities that inverted our previous positions. Money doesn't change who you are as a person, David said diplomatically, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced by his own assertion. No, I agreed, but it changes how other people treat you, and it changes what kind of treatment you're willing to accept. The truth of that statement settled over our gathering like evening shadows, gradual but unmistakable in their transformation of familiar landscape. I could see my family processing not just the revelation about the bracelet, but the implications of my changed circumstances for future interactions and family dynamics. Emma and Sophia emerged from the pool, chattering about their swimming accomplishments while wrapped in towels that made them look like small, colorful ghosts. Their easy friendship provided welcome relief from adult tensions, reminding everyone present that some relationships transcended financial considerations and family politics. Mama, can we eat lunch now? Emma asked, apparently unaware of the undercurrents that had charged the afternoon with significance. I'm getting really hungry from all that swimming. Of course, baby, I said, grateful for the excuse to focus on immediate practical needs rather than continuing to navigate the complex emotions swirling around the patio table. Lunch proceeded with the kind of forced normalcy that characterized family gatherings where significant conflicts had been temporarily set aside rather than resolved. Conversation focused on safe topics like the children's summer activities and David's barbecuing techniques, while the appraisal document remained on the table like a silent participant in our meal. But I noticed subtle changes in how my family interacted with me throughout the afternoon. Jessica asked about my work with genuine curiosity rather than condescending interest.
My parents included me more actively in conversations about family planning and future gatherings. David offered opinions about investment strategies and financial planning resources with the respect he typically reserved for fellow business professionals. The shifts were small but unmistakable, reflecting adjustments in their perception of my competence and worth that probably weren't entirely conscious but were certainly significant. For the first time in family gatherings, I felt like my thoughts and opinions were being solicited as contributions rather than tolerated as obligations. As the afternoon wound down, and Emma and I prepared to leave, Jessica approached me with an expression that mixed apology with something that might have been genuine admiration. "I owe you an apology," she said quietly, keeping her voice low enough that the rest of the family couldn't overhear. "About the bracelet, about the restaurant last week, about a lot of things probably. I was wrong to dismiss something that mattered to you." "Thank you," I said, surprised by how much her acknowledgement meant despite my anger about her previous behavior. "That means a lot. Can I ask you something?" she continued, glancing toward Emma, who was hugging our parents goodbye. "What are you going to do with this information?" With the bracelet, it was the question I'd been asking myself since Wednesday afternoon, the one that felt too enormous to answer definitively. The bracelet represented not just financial security but choices about the kind of life I wanted to build for Emma and myself, about whether to embrace the transformation it offered or continue living quietly with extraordinary secrets. "I'm going to wear it," I said finally, looking down at Elena's bracelet where it rested against my wrist, just like she did. "And I'm going to make sure Emma understands that some things are valuable because of the love they carry, not just because of what they cost, but the money." Jessica started, then stopped herself. "I'm sorry, that's not really my business anymore, is it?" "No," I said gently, "it's not, but I'm glad you recognize that." The drive home took us through familiar Phoenix neighborhoods that looked subtly different in the late afternoon light, as if the revelation about Elena's bracelet had shifted my perception of everything around us. Emma dozed in her car seat, exhausted from swimming and socializing, while I processed the afternoon's emotional whiplash and tried to envision what came next. That evening, after Emma was settled with her bedtime story and evening routine, I sat in my living room holding the bracelet and thinking about Elena's final words with new understanding. She'd known exactly what she was entrusting to me, not just a valuable piece of jewelry, but the responsibility of deciding how to honor both its material worth and its emotional significance. I thought about the insurance papers I'd signed, the financial advisors I planned to consult, the college fund I could establish for Emma that would eliminate every anxiety about her educational future. But I also thought about Elena's example, about the quiet dignity with which she'd carried extraordinary wealth without letting it define or constrain her choices. The bracelet had already changed my life in ways that extended far beyond its monetary value. It had revealed truths about my family's perceptions and priorities that painful but necessary to understand. It had given me confidence to set boundaries and assert my worth in relationships where I'd previously accepted diminished status. Most importantly, it had connected me to Elena's legacy in ways that transcended the physical inheritance. She'd passed down not just diamonds and precious metals, but an example of how to carry treasure with grace, how to value security over display, how to trust future generations with both wealth and wisdom. As I fastened the bracelet around my wrist for another night of dreams, I realized that Elena's greatest gift hadn't been the $5 million worth of diamonds and craftsmanship. Her greatest gift had been showing me that I was worthy of something extraordinary, that I could be trusted with responsibility and respect, that my choices and judgment mattered enough to stake a fortune on their soundness. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as I learned to navigate life as someone who carried hidden wealth while maintaining visible modesty. There would be decisions about financial management, estate planning, and how much of this transformation to share with Emma as she grew older. There would be continued family dynamics to manage as everyone adjusted to shifted perceptions and altered hierarchies. But tonight, wearing Elena's bracelet in my modest apartment where we'd built a life rich in love and learning if not material luxury, I felt something I'd never experienced before: the quiet confidence that comes from knowing you're exactly where you're supposed to be, carrying exactly what you're meant to carry, loved by someone who saw your true value long before the rest of the world caught up. Elena had been right about everything. The bracelet was never about the money. It was about recognition, respect, and the revolutionary power of finally understanding your own worth. 2 years had passed since the museum documentation, and Emma was now 10 years old, with the kind of confidence that comes from growing up secure but not spoiled. She understood that our family possessed something extraordinary, but more importantly, she understood the responsibility that came with such privilege. The bracelet had become part of our daily reality, worn with the same casual reverence that Elena had demonstrated throughout her life. The morning started like any other Tuesday, with Emma getting ready for school while I prepared for my work at the library's new rare manuscripts division, a department I'd helped establish through strategic donations that remained anonymous to my colleagues. The routine felt comfortably normal, despite the underlying transformation that had reshaped every aspect of our existence. But this particular Tuesday would prove different because of an unexpected visitor who appeared at our front door just as Emma was gathering her backpack for school. The woman looked to be in her 70s, well-dressed, but not ostentatious, with silver hair styled in a way that suggested European sensibilities rather than American trends. "Excuse me," she said in accented English that carried hints of Spanish inflection, "but I believe you are Sarah Martinez, granddaughter of Elena Martinez." Something about her manner, the careful formality mixed with underlying emotion, made me invite her inside rather than conducting the conversation on our doorstep. Emma, always curious about unexpected visitors, lingered near the living room entrance while I offered coffee and tried to understand what had brought this stranger to our home. "My name is Carmen Delgado," the woman continued, settling into our comfortable chair with movements that suggested both elegance and age. "I have traveled from Barcelona to speak with you about something that belonged to my grandmother, something I believe Elena carried to America many decades ago." The mention of Barcelona sent electricity through my nervous system, connecting to research I'd been conducting about the bracelet's European origins. I'd traced fragments of information suggesting Spanish connections, but had never imagined that living relatives might exist who remembered the jewelry's history. "I'm afraid I don't understand," I said carefully, though my pulse was accelerating with possibilities I was afraid to consider. "What connection could your grandmother have had to Elena's possessions?" Carmen reached into her elegant handbag and withdrew a small velvet pouch that looked remarkably similar to the one Elena had used to store the bracelet during her lifetime. From within the pouch, she produced a photograph that appeared to be from the 1920s, showing two young women standing together in what looked like a formal garden setting. "This is my grandmother, Isabella Delgado," she said, pointing to the taller of the two women. "And this is Elena Santos, before she married and became Elena Martinez." I studied the photograph with growing amazement, recognizing Elena's features despite the decades that separated the young woman in the image from the grandmother I'd known. But more shocking was what I could see on Elena's wrist in the faded photograph, a bracelet that looked unmistakably similar to the one currently resting against my own skin. "They were sisters," Carmen continued, her voice carrying the weight of family history that had been preserved across continents and generations. "Not by blood, but by choice and circumstance. When political tensions made life dangerous for families like ours in Spain, they made a pact to protect each other's treasures if separation became necessary." Emma had moved closer during Carmen's explanation, her young face reflecting fascination with the story unfolding in our living room. I gestured for her to join us, understanding that whatever Carmen was about to reveal would become part of Emma's inheritance of family knowledge. "Isabella and Elena each carried identical bracelets," Carmen explained, producing a second photograph that showed both women's jewelry more clearly. "They were commissioned by their families as portable wealth, designed to look modest while containing extraordinary value. When Elena left for America, she carried both bracelets with the promise that she would someday return Isabella's inheritance to her descendants." The revelation hit me like physical force, rewriting everything I thought I understood about Elena's secret and the responsibility she'd entrusted to me. The bracelet I'd been wearing wasn't just my inheritance, it was potentially someone else's family treasure that Elena had been safeguarding until the right moment for return. "But Elena never returned to Spain," I said slowly, trying to process the implications of Carmen's story. "She lived her entire adult life in Arizona. She wrote letters," Carmen said, reaching again into her handbag to produce a bundle of correspondence tied with ribbon. "To Isabella, then to my mother, then to me, always promising that when the time was right, when it was safe, she would ensure that both families' legacies were preserved properly." Carmen untied the ribbon and selected a letter from the top of the bundle, one that appeared more recent than the others. This was Elena's final letter to me, written just months before her death. She explained that she had chosen her granddaughter Sarah as the guardian of both bracelets, trusting that you would have the wisdom to understand what needed to be done when the surviving family members made contact. I accepted the letter with trembling hands, recognizing Elena's careful handwriting, despite the shakiness that age had introduced to her penmanship. The date confirmed Carmen's claim that it had been written during Elena's final months, when she was making decisions about her legacy and my inheritance. My dear Carmen, the letter began, the time has come for me to pass the responsibility of our family's treasures to the next generation. My granddaughter Sarah has proven herself worthy of this trust through her integrity, intelligence, and commitment to preserving what matters most. When you are ready to reclaim Isabella's bracelet, seek her out in Phoenix, Arizona. She will understand that some promises transcend individual ownership, that love shared across generations creates obligations that must be honored regardless of personal attachment. The letter continued with details about my character and circumstances that Elena had apparently been sharing with Carmen for years, creating a connection between our families that I'd never suspected existed. Elena had been preparing for this moment, ensuring that when the time came for the bracelets to be reunited or returned, I would have enough context to make the right decision. I don't understand, Emma said, her voice small with confusion. Does this mean our bracelet really belongs to Carmen's family? The question cut to the heart of my own bewilderment, forcing me to confront the possibility that everything I'd built on the foundation of Elena's gift might need to be reevaluated. But Carmen's expression suggested complications beyond simple ownership claims. It's more complex than that, dear child, Carmen said gently, her tone carrying the patience of someone who'd spent years thinking through these very questions. Elena carried both bracelets, but only one belonged to Isabella's family. The other was always meant for Elena's descendants. The challenge is determining which bracelet carries which legacy. She produced a magnifying glass from her handbag, the kind used by jewelry professionals for detailed examination. There are subtle differences in the craftsmanship that distinguish the two pieces. Isabella's bracelet contains a specific marking, a tiny inscription that identifies it as part of our family's collection. I removed Elena's bracelet from my wrist with hands that trembled slightly, understanding that the next few minutes might fundamentally alter my family's future. Carmen examined it carefully under magnification, her breathing becoming more focused as she studied details invisible to casual observation. The inscription is here, she said finally, pointing to a section of the silver work that looked identical to every other part of the bracelet to my untrained eyes. This bracelet belongs to Isabella's family, carried safely across an ocean, and preserved through decades of Elena's faithful guardianship. The confirmation that I'd been wearing someone else's family treasure for years created a complex mixture of emotions that I struggled to process. Relief that Elena's own bracelet must still exist somewhere, combined with sadness about losing the connection to her memory that wearing her jewelry had provided. But strongest of all was gratitude that Elena had trusted me with such an important responsibility, even if I hadn't understood its full scope. Where is Elena's bracelet? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady despite the emotional whirlwind created by these revelations. Carmen smiled with an expression that mixed sympathy with anticipation. Elena was careful to ensure that both bracelets would be returned to their proper families when the time was right. According to her letters, she placed her own bracelet in a safety deposit box with specific instructions for its retrieval. She handed me another document, this one appearing to be a copy of Elena's safety deposit box inventory and access instructions. The paperwork showed that Elena had maintained a box at a downtown Phoenix bank, with provisions for my access that had apparently been in place since before her death. She wanted you to have both the experience of wearing Isabella's bracelet and the knowledge of why such treasures must sometimes be returned to their rightful families, Carmen explained. It was part of your education in understanding the difference between ownership and stewardship. The lesson felt profound and typically Elena-like in its complexity. She'd given me an inheritance that taught responsibility and sacrifice alongside prosperity, ensuring that I understood wealth as something that carried obligations rather than just privileges. Emma had been listening to this conversation with the intensity she brought to her favorite books, processing concepts about family, responsibility, and cross-generational promises with remarkable maturity. Mama, are you sad about giving the bracelet back to Carmen? The question forced me to examine my feelings honestly, separating attachment to a beautiful object from understanding of what the right action required. I'm grateful that we could take care of it until Carmen was ready to receive it, I said carefully. That's what great-grandma Elena wanted us to do. And you'll still have her real bracelet, Emma pointed out with 8-year-old logic. The one that really belonged to her, and was always meant for our family. Her perspective helped clarify the emotional landscape, reminding me that returning Isabella's bracelet to Carmen wouldn't diminish Elena's gift to us. If anything, it would complete the circle of responsibility that Elena had been maintaining for decades. The trip to the bank took place that afternoon, with Carmen, Emma, and me traveling together to retrieve Elena's safety deposit box and discover what she'd preserved there. The bank manager, accustomed to unusual requests involving family inheritances, facilitated our access to the box with professional discretion. Inside the safety deposit box, wrapped in the same kind of velvet pouch that Carmen had brought, lay a bracelet that was simultaneously familiar and completely new. It matched Isabella's bracelet in overall design, but carried subtle differences in the stone arrangements and metalwork that spoke of individual craftsmanship rather than mass
production. But more importantly, this bracelet carried Elena's personal energy in ways that Isabella's never had. I could imagine her wearing it to church services and family gatherings, could envision her careful maintenance of its beauty throughout decades of modest living. This was the jewelry that connected to my actual inheritance, the treasure she'd preserved specifically for my family's future. Carmen examined Elena's bracelet with the same professional attention she'd given to Isabella's, confirming through magnification that it carried different markings and craftsmen's signatures. "Both pieces are extraordinary," she said with genuine admiration. "Our grandmothers chose their treasures well." The exchange ceremony felt both formal and intimate, taking place in the bank's private consultation room where such transactions were conducted away from public observation. Carmen presented Isabella's bracelet to me one final time before I placed it in her hands, while I fastened Elena's actual bracelet around my wrist where it belonged. "This completes a promise made nearly a century ago," Carmen said, her eyes bright with tears as she held her grandmother's recovered treasure. Isabella would be so proud that Elena's granddaughter proved worthy of such trust. The weight of Elena's actual bracelet felt different on my wrist, somehow more substantial despite being virtually identical to Isabella's in size and materials. But more than physical sensation, there was an emotional rightness to wearing jewelry that had always been intended for me rather than held in temporary stewardship. Emma had watched the entire exchange with fascination, processing lessons about integrity, family responsibility, and the complexity of inheritances that extend beyond simple material transfer. Her questions during our drive home revealed sophisticated thinking about promise-keeping and cross-generational obligations. "Mama, how did great-grandma Elena know that we would do the right thing about Carmen's bracelet?" The question touched the heart of Elena's extraordinary faith in my character, her willingness to entrust me with responsibility that could have been handled selfishly or dishonestly. "I think she knew because she'd been watching how we treated things that mattered to other people," I said. "She saw that we could be trusted with something precious. And now Carmen's family has their treasure back, and we have ours." "Exactly. Sometimes the most valuable thing you can do is help other people get what belongs to them." That evening, as I examined Elena's actual bracelet under proper lighting for the first time, I discovered details that had been invisible during my years of wearing Isabella's piece. The stones were arranged in a pattern that suggested celestial navigation, with larger diamonds positioned to mirror star formations that might have guided travelers across oceans. The discovery led to research that revealed Elena's family connection to maritime navigation, with ancestors who'd worked as navigators and cartographers before political upheaval forced their emigration. The bracelet wasn't just portable wealth, it was a map to the stars, a tool for finding direction when everything else seemed lost. Understanding this symbolism added layers of meaning to Elena's gift that extended far beyond monetary value. She'd left me not just financial security but a reminder that navigation through life's challenges required both practical resources and spiritual guidance, both material foundation and moral compass. Carmen remained in Phoenix for several more days, sharing family stories and photographs that filled gaps in my understanding of Elena's life before immigration. The friendship that developed between us felt like a continuation of the bond that had connected our grandmothers across decades and continents. "Elena wrote about you for years," Carmen told me during one of our coffee conversations. "She was so proud of your intelligence and integrity, so confident that you would understand the responsibilities that came with family treasures." The validation from someone who'd known Elena through correspondence felt precious beyond measure, confirming that the woman I'd loved and admired had seen qualities in me that I was still learning to recognize in myself. Before Carmen's departure, she and I established a correspondence agreement that would maintain the connection our grandmothers had preserved. Our families were forever linked through shared history and mutual trust, bound by promises kept across generations and continents. Emma had become particularly attached to Carmen during her visit, fascinated by stories of Barcelona and the family castle where Isabella had lived before emigration. Carmen promised to send photographs and stories that would help Emma understand her extended family heritage, creating connections that enriched our sense of identity and belonging.
The weeks following Carmen's return to Spain brought integration of everything I'd learned about Elena's true legacy and my actual inheritance. Wearing her real bracelet felt like carrying her presence in ways that Isabella's piece, beautiful as it was, never had. The emotional connection was profound and immediate, as if Elena's spirit had been waiting for this reunion. Financial planning took on new dimensions as I considered how to honor Elena's example of preserving wealth while living modestly. The Education Trust for Emma was expanded to include funding for international travel and language study, ensuring that she would understand her European heritage as well as her American opportunities. I also established a scholarship fund for first-generation college students, particularly those from immigrant families who understood the significance of opportunities that previous generations had sacrificed to provide. Elena's gift was becoming a catalyst for educational advancement that would extend far beyond our immediate family. Emma's 10th birthday celebration included a small ceremony where I explained the full story of Elena's bracelet and the responsibility that would someday pass to her. She listened with the seriousness that important family traditions deserved, asking thoughtful questions about stewardship and promise-keeping. "When I'm grown up and have the bracelet," she said thoughtfully, "I want to wear it every day like you do, so other people can see that beautiful things don't have to be hidden away." Her perspective reflected Elena's values perfectly, understanding that treasures were meant to be appreciated rather than hoarded, that beauty shared enriched both giver and receiver. The lesson about living fully while protecting what mattered would guide Emma throughout her life regardless of her material circumstances. As I tucked her into bed that night, Emma asked the question that had been building throughout our day of family history and future planning. "Mama, do you think great-grandma Elena knew that her bracelet would teach us so much about being good people?" I considered her question carefully, thinking about Elena's lifetime of quiet wisdom and the carefully orchestrated lessons she'd embedded in her final gift to our family. "I think she knew that the most valuable things she could give us weren't made of diamonds or silver," I said, adjusting Elena's bracelet on my wrist where it caught moonlight from Emma's bedroom window. "I think she knew that learning to be trustworthy and generous and strong would matter more than any amount of money. And the bracelet helps us remember that we're part of something bigger than ourselves. That we're connected to family who believed in us, and responsible to family who will come after us." Emma nodded with understanding that seemed deeper than her years, processing concepts about legacy and responsibility that would shape her character throughout her life. Elena's influence was extending into another generation, creating ripples of wisdom and strength that would continue long after the bracelet itself had been passed down again. As I turned off her bedroom light and made my way through our comfortable home, I reflected on the journey that had brought us to this moment of understanding and security. Elena's gift had transformed our circumstances, but more importantly, it had revealed truths about worth, responsibility, and the power of believing in someone's potential for goodness. The bracelet on my wrist represented not just financial inheritance, but generational wisdom, not just family treasure but family trust. Elena had seen something in me that I was still learning to see in myself, and her faith had become the foundation for building a life worthy of such extraordinary confidence. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities to use our security wisely, to model for Emma the kind of integrity that creates lasting positive impact, to honor Elena's memory through choices that reflected her values rather than just her material legacy. But tonight, wearing her actual bracelet for the first time, and feeling her presence in every facet of light that danced across its surface, I understood finally that the greatest treasure Elena had given me wasn't diamonds or precious metals or financial security. The greatest treasure was the knowledge that I had always been worthy of something extraordinary, that I possessed the strength and wisdom to protect what mattered most, that I was part of a legacy of women who carried themselves with dignity regardless of circumstances. Elena had been right about everything. The bracelet was never about the money, it was about recognition, respect, and the revolutionary power of finally understanding that you've always been enough. 5 years had passed since Carmen's visit, and Emma was now 15, with the kind of thoughtful maturity that comes from growing up understanding both privilege and responsibility. The bracelet had become as much a part of our family's daily rhythm as morning coffee or evening homework sessions, worn with the natural ease that Elena had always demonstrated. This particular autumn morning brought an invitation that would test everything we'd learned about family dynamics and personal boundaries. Jessica had called the night before with news that initially sounded routine, a family reunion being planned to celebrate our parents' 40th wedding anniversary, a gathering that would include extended relatives we hadn't seen in years. But the conversation had taken an unexpected turn when Jessica mentioned that several family members were struggling financially, casualties of economic uncertainty and poor planning decisions. "It would mean so much to everyone if you could help out," she'd said, her voice carrying the particular tone she used when approaching delicate topics. Not as a loan or anything formal, just family helping family through difficult times. The request felt simultaneously reasonable and problematic, touching on questions about wealth responsibility that had become increasingly complex as our circumstances evolved. Emma had overheard enough of the conversation to understand the implications, her expression reflecting the same careful consideration I was wrestling with myself. "They're asking for money because they know about the bracelet now," she'd observed with 15-year-old directness. "But they never helped us when we needed it." Her assessment was accurate but incomplete, missing the nuanced obligations that come with extraordinary resources, and the reality that family relationships require ongoing navigation regardless of past grievances. The morning brought time for deeper conversation about these complexities as we prepared breakfast together in our kitchen. "What do you think Great-Grandma Elena would want us to do?" Emma asked while slicing fruit with the precision she'd developed through years of cooking together. She lived modestly even though she could have helped lots of people. The question cut to the heart of ethical dilemmas that had occupied my thoughts since Jessica's call. Elena had indeed lived quietly with extraordinary wealth, choosing security over generosity in ways that might seem selfish without understanding the full context of her responsibilities and promises. "I think she'd want us to help when we can without enabling dependency," I said carefully, trying to articulate principles that felt clear in theory but complicated in practice. "The challenge is figuring out what kind of help actually helps versus what just makes us feel better about having more than others." Emma nodded thoughtfully, her understanding of these issues deepened by conversations we'd been having about wealth responsibility since she'd been old enough to grasp the concepts. She'd grown up knowing that our security came with obligations, but also understanding that meeting those obligations required wisdom rather than just generosity. The family reunion took place at a resort in Sedona, chosen by Jessica and David as a location that would accommodate varying financial circumstances, while providing the kind of elegant setting that reflected our family's aspirational identity. Emma and I arrived with carefully considered gifts for the anniversary celebration, presents that reflected thoughtfulness rather than expense. The gathering included aunts, uncles, and cousins I hadn't seen since childhood, many of whom had apparently been briefed about our changed circumstances, in ways that made conversation feel awkward and loaded with unspoken expectations. The bracelet drew attention immediately, its subtle beauty, more apparent to people who now knew what they were looking at. "Sarah's done so well for herself," my Aunt Patricia commented during the cocktail hour, her tone mixing genuine affection with something that might have been envy. "It's wonderful how some people get blessed with opportunities to help their whole family." The comment, delivered with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, established the tone for interactions throughout the weekend. Family members who'd previously shown little interest in my life suddenly wanted detailed updates about work, investments, and future plans, conversations that felt more like auditions for financial assistance than genuine relationship building. Emma navigated these dynamics with grace that impressed me, deflecting personal questions about our lifestyle, while maintaining warmth toward relatives she barely remembered. Her social skills had developed significantly over the years, shaped by diverse experiences that exposed her to people from various backgrounds and circumstances. The formal anniversary dinner provided a platform for speeches and toasts that celebrated my parents' marriage while subtly highlighting various family members' current challenges. Jessica's toast was particularly skillful, weaving together genuine sentiment about family bonds with gentle references to how fortunate families support each other through difficult times. When my turn came to speak, I felt the weight of family expectations settling around the microphone, like fog, everyone waiting to hear how I would address the financial elephant in the room. Emma's encouraging smile from across the table reminded me that my words would matter not just for immediate family dynamics but for her understanding of how to handle wealth with dignity. "Mom and Dad, your 40 years together have shown us what commitment really means," I began, focusing on the celebration rather than the underlying tensions. "You've taught us that families support each other not just through money or material gifts, but through presence, patience, and unconditional love." I continued by acknowledging the various ways family members had enriched each other's lives over the decades, highlighting contributions that couldn't be measured financially but had created lasting positive impact. The speech received warm applause, though I could sense disappointment from relatives who'd hoped for more explicit promises of financial assistance. After dinner, during the social hour that extended into the evening, several family members approached me privately with specific requests for help. A cousin needed assistance with mortgage payments, an uncle was struggling with medical bills, a niece required funding for college tuition that financial aid hadn't covered. Each request came with compelling circumstances and genuine need, creating the kind of ethical complexity that wealth brings to family relationships. I listened with sympathy and promised to consider each situation carefully, understanding that my responses would establish precedents for future interactions. Emma had been observing these conversations from across the room, her expression reflecting growing understanding of the pressures that accompany visible prosperity. During a quiet moment on the resort's terrace, she voiced concerns that demonstrated remarkable insight for someone her age. "It feels like they see you differently now," she said, watching family members through the window as they continued socializing inside. "Like you're not really their relative anymore, just someone who might solve their problems." Her observation captured something I'd been struggling to articulate about the subtle but significant shift in family dynamics since our circumstances had changed. The bracelet had revealed not just its own value but the values of people around us, showing how quickly affection could become complicated by financial considerations. "That's one of the hardest things about having money," I acknowledged. "It's difficult to know whether people care about you or just what you can do for them. But some of them really do need help," Emma pointed out, her sense of fairness wrestling with her protective instincts about our family's well-being. "Uncle Mike's medical bills aren't his fault, and Cousin Lisa really wants to go to college." The distinction she was making between deserving need and opportunistic requests showed sophisticated thinking about wealth responsibility, understanding that the goal wasn't to avoid helping people, but to help in ways that created positive long-term outcomes, rather than short-term relief that enabled ongoing dependency. Over the remainder of the weekend, I found myself in multiple conversations about family financial dynamics, discussions that revealed both the blessing and burden of being the relative with resources to share. Some family members approached the topic with genuine humility, acknowledging the complexity of asking for help, while respecting my right to make decisions about my own resources. Others seemed to feel entitled to assistance based on family connection alone, their requests carrying undertones of guilt and obligation that felt manipulative rather than genuine. The difference in approaches helped clarify my thinking about how to respond to various needs, while maintaining healthy boundaries. Emma participated in family activities with the kind of gracious engagement that made me proud of her character development, but I noticed her becoming more observant about family dynamics and more protective of our privacy regarding financial details. The weekend was providing education about wealth management that no formal curriculum could replicate. The drive home through Arizona's desert landscape provided opportunity for reflection and processing of everything we'd experienced during the family gathering. Emma had been quiet for most of the journey, apparently thinking through the conversations and interactions she'd witnessed. "I understand now why great-grandma Elena lived so quietly," she said, as we approached Phoenix, her voice carrying new appreciation for Elena's choices. "Having money makes everything more complicated with other people." Her insight reflected understanding that would serve her well throughout life, recognition that wealth could enhance relationships when handled wisely, but could also create dynamics that undermine genuine connection if not managed carefully. Elena knew that the most important wealth was the kind that couldn't be taken away or given away, I replied, thinking about the lessons embedded in Elena's example of modest living despite extraordinary resources. Character integrity, the ability to make good decisions under pressure. And she trusted you to learn those lessons through experience rather than just being told about them. The observation highlighted Elena's sophisticated approach to legacy building, her understanding that true inheritance involved wisdom and character development, rather than simple material transfer. She'd structured my inheritance to include education about responsibility, generosity, and the complexity of family relationships around money. The weeks following the reunion brought follow-up conversations with various family members about their requests for assistance. I approached each situation individually, researching the circumstances and considering both immediate needs and long-term implications of different types of help. For Uncle Mike's medical bills, I chose to make a direct payment to the hospital rather than giving cash that might be diverted to other purposes. For Cousin Lisa's college funding, I established a scholarship account that covered tuition and books, but required maintained academic performance for continued support. Each decision reflected principles Elena had modeled about strategic generosity that created positive outcomes, rather than enabling dependency. The responses from family members varied based on their understanding of these distinctions, some expressing genuine gratitude, while others seemed disappointed by the structured nature of assistance. Emma watched these processes unfold with interest, asking questions about decision-making criteria and long-term thinking that helped refine my own understanding of wealth responsibility. Her questions often illuminated aspects of situations that I hadn't considered fully, her perspective enriching my analysis of complex family dynamics. The Christmas holidays brought another family gathering, this one smaller and more intimate, focused on immediate family, rather than the extended network from the anniversary celebration. The dynamics felt more relaxed without the pressure of multiple requests for assistance, allowing for genuine conversation and relationship building. Jessica had undergone her own evolution in our relationship, moving beyond the awkwardness that initially accompanied our shifted financial circumstances towards something approaching genuine friendship. Her success at work continued to provide identity and satisfaction that didn't depend on comparison with my situation. "I've been thinking about what you said at the anniversary dinner," she told me, during a quiet moment, while our children played together in the backyard. "About families supporting each other in ways that aren't financial." I realized I'd been so focused on money that I'd forgotten other ways of being helpful. Her reflection led to conversations about different types of family contribution, recognizing that emotional support, practical assistance, and shared experiences often mattered more than financial help in creating strong family bonds. The bracelet had taught lessons about value that extended far beyond its monetary worth. Emma's relationship with her extended family had deepened through these experiences, her understanding of family complexity, balanced by appreciation for the genuine affection that existed alongside financial considerations. She'd learned to navigate wealth dynamics, while maintaining authentic connections with relatives she cared about. As we drove home from the Christmas gathering, Emma asked the question that had been building throughout months of family interactions and wealth responsibility decisions. "Mama, when I inherit the bracelet someday, will people treat me the way they treat you now?" The question touched fears I had about Emma's future, concerns about how extraordinary inheritance might affect her relationships and character development. But it also provided opportunity to discuss strategies for handling wealth with wisdom and grace. "Probably," I said honestly, "but you'll be prepared for it in ways I wasn't. You're learning now about the difference between people who care about you and people who care about what you can do for them. And I'll know that the bracelet's real value isn't the diamonds. What is its real value?" She considered the question with the thoughtfulness that had characterized her approach to complex issues throughout her childhood. "It's proof that someone believed in us enough to trust us with something extraordinary. It's connection to family, who faced hard times and stayed strong. It's responsibility to use what we have in ways that make the world better." Her understanding reflected everything Elena had hoped to teach through her carefully orchestrated inheritance, lessons about character and responsibility that would guide Emma throughout her life regardless of her material circumstances. The bracelet had become a tool for wisdom development, rather than just financial security. That evening, as I tucked the bracelet into its velvet pouch for the night, I reflected on the journey that had brought our family to this point of understanding and peace. Elena's gift had transformed our circumstances, but more importantly, it had revealed truths about worth, family, and the responsibility that comes with extraordinary blessings. Emma had grown up understanding both privilege and obligation, developing character that would serve her well when she eventually inherited not just material wealth, but the wisdom to handle it with grace. Elena's influence was extending into another generation, creating ripples of positive impact that would continue long after the bracelet itself had been passed down again. The next morning brought news that would add another chapter to our family's story. Carmen had written from Barcelona, with information about a family foundation she was establishing to support educational opportunities for immigrant families. She was inviting Emma and me to serve on the International Advisory Board, creating connections between our American experiences and European heritage. The opportunity represented everything Elena had valued about family legacy, using resources to create positive impact while maintaining connections across generations and continents. Emma's excitement about participating in international philanthropy reflected values that would guide her throughout life. As I fastened Elena's bracelet around my wrist to begin another day, I understood finally that its greatest power wasn't the security it provided or the respect it commanded. Its greatest power was the daily reminder that I was part of something larger than myself, connected to family who had believed in my potential, and responsible to family who would inherit both material blessings and spiritual wisdom.
Elena had been right about everything. The bracelet was never about the money, it was about recognition, respect, and the revolutionary power of finally understanding that you've always been enough. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.